Ah, my dear friend, close your eyes for a moment and try to hear the sound of the vast steppes, the wind dancing on the grass, the horses' hoofbeats on the earth. Here, in this vast land, echoed the footsteps of a man. His name was Genghis Khan, but when he was born, there was no trace of that name. There was only poverty, a harsh life, and a fate woven with blood. After mourning after a dark night, this boy, known as Temujin, carried hope even in his family's hard times. As a young boy, he had seen his father die. He had been ostracized from his clan. He had learned what it meant to starve and struggle to survive. But my friend, this is where fate comes in. In the midst of a world waiting to crush the weak, Temujin did not bow down. Life was a challenge for him, and he accepted it. Today, I will not only tell you the story of one man, I will share with you the spirit of the steppes, the song of swords, and the rebirth of a nation. This journey is the story of an ordinary boy who became one of the greatest emperors in the world. And my dear friend, this story will take you into the middle of storms that will take your breath away. So let's go back to that first day, when the legend was born, because every great story begins with a tiny spark. Ah, my dear friends, close your eyes and listen once more to the silent song of the steppes. This time, the wind blowing across the endless grass whispers like a harbinger of victory. Here, on a hot summer day in 1206, a man was about to make a decision that would forever etch his name as one of the greatest leaders of all time. That man was Genghis Khan, universal ruler of the steppes. The rise of Genghis Khan, my friend, was not just the achievement of an individual. It was the unification of tribes that had been at war and hostile to each other for centuries. But this unity could not be achieved by mere words or promises. Blood had been shed, loyalty oaths sworn, alliances forged, and betrayals endured. Temujin showed incredible intelligence and patience in the process of uniting each tribe. Sometimes he defeated his enemies and recruited them into his army. Sometimes he forgave his former enemies in order to turn them into allies. But these friendships and victories did not come easily. From his youth, Temujin had learned lessons from all the hardships he faced. When his family struggled with hunger, he learned about loyalty. When he was captured, he understood how strong a leader's will to survive must be. These lessons laid the foundations for his military and strategic genius. My friend Genghis Khan's military strategies influenced not only his time but also the ages to come. He organized the army into small and flexible units, each unit capable enough to act independently of the others, yet cohesive enough to work in great coordination. His trust in his commanders and his combination of discipline and speed revolutionized the battlefield. And of course, horses were at the heart of the Mongol army. These animals were not just a means of transportation. They were the wings of the Mongol soldiers. A Mongol archer on horseback could not only move swiftly, but also shoot his arrows with great accuracy. Genghis Khan understood the power of mobility on the battlefield and weaponized it. The year 1206 was a turning point for the Mongols. Temujin was no longer a leader but an emperor, as he was given the title Genghis Khan at a great assembly convened on the banks of the Yanhan River. This title represented not only his sovereignty over the tribes, but also the first sign of the future conquests of the Mongols. But my dear friends, the story of Genghis Khan does not end here. The real adventure begins when he expanded the borders of his powerful empire beyond the steppes. But how did this invincible army spread across the globe? What made them so powerful and terrifying? Let's discover the answers to these questions together. My dear friend, sit down beside me and close your eyes. Let your mind take you on a journey down the dusty roads of the past. Now I will take you to the heart of the Mongolian steppes. When you open your eyes, you will see a vast plain before you. Here, the soil is not just the soil itself. Here, each grain of sand is the footprint of a warrior, the mark of a sword, the mark of a nation. And those who left these marks formed the most feared and admired army in the history of the world, Mongol army. This army, my friend, was no ordinary fighting force. They were the embodiment of Genghis Khan's genius. The power of the Mongol army came not only from the bravery of its soldiers, but also from its meticulously crafted organization and flawless strategy. Everything was so well thought out that it fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Imagine chaos on a battlefield, right? But never in the Mongol army. For them, war was the dance of order. Genghis Khan organized his army based on a system of 10. This was to become one of the cornerstones of a military order. For every 10 soldiers, there was an arban. 10 arban would come together and form a zun, a unit of 100 men. Hundreds would come together to form a mingan of 1,000 men. And finally, these thousands combined to form a division of 10,000 men. But my friend, this system was not just a system of numbers. Each unit was interdependent, free enough to act independently of its leaders, but disciplined enough to follow orders. But it was not only this organization that made the Mongol army so powerful. It was the way they moved like shadows on horseback that made them a true fighting machine. Yes, my friend, the Mongol horsemen, they were like winged ghosts that changed the fate of war. Every Mongol grew up on horseback from the moment he was born. As children, perhaps their first steps were not on the ground, but on a horse. Think of a Mongol archer on horseback, agile and sharp-eyed like the eagles in the sky. Even when his horse was moving at full speed, his arrow never missed its target. And it is not just a skill, it is an art of survival. It's really too bad that we were so many concentrated on the body. Our skills, old and young. Horses themselves were no ordinary animals. The small, hardy steppe horses used by the Mongols could travel long distances tirelessly and survive in harsh climatic conditions. Thanks to these horses, the Mongol army could advance 100 kilometers a day and move at a speed that surprised their enemies. While their enemies waited for them in one place, the Mongols would attack from another. That, my friend, was the secret of their seeming invincibility in battle. And, of course, the Mongols' greatest strength was their intelligence. They won wars by frightening, deceiving, and even turning their enemies against each other. Imagine a campaign. The Mongol army pretends to flee in front of their enemies. The enemy takes advantage of this and pursues them. But, my dear friend, the Mongols were not retreating. They were merely luring their enemies to a more vulnerable position. In an instant, they turn back and surround their enemies exactly where they had planned. This was part of Genghis Khan's art of war. Another impressive tactic was their communication system. Even on the battlefield, the Mongols never interrupted the flow of information. News spread quickly and commanders adapted to orders instantly. Even in the chaos of battle, they moved in perfect harmony, like members of a symphony orchestra. And my friend, this harmony was only made possible by the charisma and leadership of Genghis Khan. Now imagine what it would be like to stand in front of such an army. Whether in the stone-walled cities of Europe or the hot deserts of the Middle East, the sound of the Mongol army echoed. Their enemy's only choice was to surrender or perish. But my dear friend, this story does not end here. The enormous power of the Mongols was not limited to conquests. How did this organized army change world history? How did Genghis Khan's vision, combined with this power, usher in a new era? Let's discover the answers to these questions together in the next episode. My friends, I will now take you beyond the distant steppes of Asia to the heart of an epic written in blood and fire. It is a story of pride, betrayal, and ruthless revenge. Close your eyes and think. Cities along endless trade routes, marketplaces studded with gold, and among them a confident ruler, Ala-ad Muhammad, Sultan of the Khwarazm Shahs. But will he be able to resist the tricks of fate? Or will he succumb to the world's greatest storm, the wrath of Genghis Khan? It all began one spring day in 1219. The Mongol Empire was on a conquest spree that stretched from China to Europe. But behind these conquests was not only Genghis Khan's desire for bloodshed, but also an effort to ensure the safety of trade. The Mongols, my friends, were not just warriors. They were a people for whom trade was as important as weapons. The security of the Silk Road was the key to wealth and power. That's why Genghis Khan extended a hand of peace to the Khwarazm Shahs. Imagine a trade caravan set off, full of precious goods, silks, spices, gold. This caravan was aiming to lay the foundations of a friendly relationship by passing through Khwarazm Shah territory. But fate, my friends, is not always written the way we want it to be. The Sultan of Khwarazm must have feared the growing power of the Mongols, because instead of accepting this peace offering, he attacked the caravan. He even confiscated their goods and had the merchants killed. This was an unacceptable insult to Genghis Khan. Although he seemed to love war, he was a leader who expected his word to be honored, and he was never one to forget such a betrayal. So in 1219, Genghis Khan decided to embark on one of the greatest revenge campaigns in history. But my friends, this was not just a battle. This was the beginning of a nightmare for the Khwarazms. The Mongol army moved like the wind and marched into Khwarazm Shah territory. Soon they reached the great cities of Central Asia, Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand. Each city tried to weather the storm, but who could stand against the Mongols' tactics? Otrar was one of the first victims. The city was walled, and its people were prepared to resist. But Genghis Khan's army had mastered the art of siege. They besieged the city, cut off its resources, and finally managed to breach the walls. The people of Otrar did not escape the wrath of the Mongols. This was only the beginning. Then came the fall of Bukhara. Bukhara was one of the richest cities of the time. Its streets were filled with goods that shone like gold. But this wealth could not escape destruction under the steel claws of the Mongol army. When Genghis Khan entered the city, he gathered the people in a square and uttered these words: "I am the wrath of God, and God would not have sent me against you if you had not committed a great sin." These words shook the souls of the people. Samarkand was perhaps the biggest victim of the Mongol storm. Its city walls were strong, its soldiers brave, but all this courage melted away in the face of the Mongols' cleverly devised tactics. Genghis Khan used the captured locals as human shields, driving his enemies to a psychological collapse. My friends, this was not just a battle. This was Genghis Khan's way of declaring his power and ruthlessness to the world. But the real tragedy was the end of the Khwarazm Shah Sultan Alauddin Muhammad. This self-confident ruler was defeated in front of the Mongol armies. After losing his cities one by one, he fled like a deserter. He died in solitude and despair on an island in the Caspian Sea. The Mongols had ravaged Central Asia and seized control of the Silk Road, and the whole universe failed to take his testimony as to the horrible nature of his crimes and its horrible effect. Ah, my friends, who could stand against such power? The Mongol army wiped out not only lands but also people. But think about it. Did Genghis Khan have a bigger dream behind this destruction? How did his campaign shape the world of the future? We will look for the answers to these questions in our next story. Ah, my friends, there are ancient cities that bear the unforgettable traces of years. Cities whose stones speak history, whose streets whisper the past. Bukhara and Samarkand, the dazzling pearls of Central Asia, were once the pride and wealth of this land. But fate was preparing to write a dark chapter for these cities. This is a story of the conquest of not only the land, but also the soul of a people. Let us relive this sad saga together. In 1219, Genghis Khan's armies entered the territory of the Khwarazmshahs in a relentless campaign of revenge. Atra was the first city to be hit, and then the Mongol storm moved on to Bukhara. Bukhara, my friends, imagine the wealth of this city. Gold-embroidered fabrics, markets filled with the scent of spices, magnificent libraries where scholars debated philosophy and astronomy and madrasas. The streets of Bukhara sparkled not only with wealth but also with knowledge. But what could this glorious city do against Genghis Khan's armies? When the Mongols reached Bukhara, the people of the city tried desperately to resist behind the walls. But how long could this resistance last? The Mongols' siege tactics were beyond anything else. Huge catapults, fireballs, and a deadly rain of arrows that breached the city walls. After a while, the resistance of the people was broken, and the city gates were opened. When Genghis Khan entered Bukhara with his army, the city was silent. Imagine that moment, my friends. A fear that settled in every corner. A weight that felt in every heart. The people gathered in the big square. Imagine Genghis Khan standing tall on his horse, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. His words cut the silence of the moment. I am the wrath of God. If you had not sinned a great sin, God would not have sent me against you. These words were not just a threat, but a summary of how the Mongols saw the world. The people of Bukhara were forced to submit. But submission was not enough to save the city. The Mongols looted everything. Marketplaces were emptied, libraries were burned, houses were left in ruins. The splendor of Bukhara was reduced to ashes overnight. What remains are whispers lost in the ruins. But the Mongol storm did not stop there, my friends. After Bukhara, it was Samarkand's turn. Samarkand was a city even beyond Bukhara. It was a sanctuary of scholars, artists, and merchants, a paradise with blue domes that defied the sky. When the people of the city heard the approaching footsteps of the Mongols, they were terrified. But Samarkand thought it would be more resilient than Bukhara. Its walls were stronger, its troops more numerous. People believed that resistance was possible. But Genghis Khan was not only a warrior, he was a master strategist. He did not rely solely on his weapons to break through Samarkand's strong walls. He made living shields from the inhabitants of other cities captured during the siege. He was ruthless enough to break the souls of his enemies. Imagine, my friends, the soldiers waiting on the ramparts, seeing their own people marching in front of the advancing Mongol army. It was a tactic that destroyed not only the walls, but also hope. In a short time, the walls of Samarkand fell. The city was at the mercy of the Mongol army, and that mercy, my friends, never came. The Mongols razed Samarkand to the ground, as they had Bukhara. The city's magnificent temples, libraries, marketplaces, all were reduced to ashes. But most painful were the human stories. Families were torn apart, lives ended, and Samarkand's golden age faded into history. These two great cities were not just stone and earth. They were symbols of knowledge, culture, and human creativity. But by destroying these symbols, Genghis Khan's armies were proclaiming their power to the world. The fall of Bukhara and Samarkand changed the fate not only of the Khwarezm Shahs, but of all of Central Asia. The Mongols not only conquered territories, but also reshaped the course of human history. But my friends, the expansionist policies of the Mongol Empire did not only bring destruction. There was another side to this story. In the lands they conquered, the Mongols created not only fear, but also a new order. And what was this order? How did the cultural and economic landscape of Central Asia change after the fall of the Khwarezm Shah? We will meet in our next story to explore these. My friends, now I will take you to the land of Iran, an ancient land that has been home to many civilizations throughout history, the cradle of poetry and science. But this time our story begins with the Mongols, who descended upon this land like a hurricane. Under the growing shadow of the Mongol Empire, Iran would become both a battlefield and a stage of transformation. The winds carried with them not only blood and fire, but also a surprising cultural fusion. Get ready, because this story reveals both the brutality of conquest and the ironic games of history. After the 1219 campaign against the Khwarezm Shahs, Genghis Khan and his army were now on the doorstep of Iran. With the collapse of the Khwarezm Shahs, the Mongols quickly took control of the vast lands of Central Asia and turned their eyes further west to Persia. This region was a center of attraction, not only for its fertile lands and strategic location, but also for its then world-renowned wealth and wisdom. But my friends, the arrival of the Mongols in Iran was not just a matter of conquest. It was a story of two worldviews, two cultures, colliding and then merging. End of story part 1. Recorded by Jean in 2005. The first major blow to Iranian territory came in the 1220s, with attacks on the Khorasan region. The Mongol armies marched across the battlefields with unparalleled speed and ruthlessness. The resistance of cities was usually short-lived, as the Mongols had mastered the art of siege and warfare. Great cities such as Nishapur, Merv, and Herat were in turn crushed under this gigantic storm. But this destruction was not only physical. Wherever they conquered, the Mongols didn't just tear down the walls, they smashed the souls of societies. The vast libraries of Nishapur the works of art of Merv, the merchants and artisans of Herat were crushed under the Mongol wrath. Ah, my friends, imagine the despair in the hearts of the Iranian people in those moments. In the face of this storm, there was no hope, no salvation. But this story was not just about destruction. The Mongols didn't just destroy the lands they conquered. They soon began to understand and even benefit from the heritage and culture of those lands. This is the turning point of our story. By 1256, the Mongol armies led by Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu Khan were about to take complete control of Iran. Hulagu was not only a warrior, but also a strategic and political genius. By establishing the Ilkhanate state in Iran, he made the Mongol presence in these lands permanent. Although the Ilkhanate was a Mongolian government, it soon gained a completely different face by interacting with Persian culture. In the reign of Hulagu Khan, an astonishing transformation took place in Iran. When the Mongols realized the rich cultural heritage of these lands, they put aside their battle axes and began to recognize the power of pens and words. Persian became one of the languages used in Mongol courts. Ilkhanate rulers patronized Persian scholars, artists, and architects. Cities once destroyed by Mongol armies were rebuilt with new splendor. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, Iranian culture took on a new form under Mongol rule. One of the most impressive examples of this transformation was seen in Iranian architecture. By combining Persian architecture with Mongolian aesthetics, Hulagu Khan and his successors built works that have stood the test of time. The mosques, madrasas, and palaces built under the Ilkhanates demonstrated not only the power of a monarchy, but also how cultures could merge and transform each other. All this, my friends, showed how an empire of war could succumb to the cultural power of the lands it conquered. While the Mongols thought they had conquered Iran, they were actually conquered by Iran's rich culture. And of course, my friends, not only physical structures changed during this period, but also ideas and beliefs. Some of the Ilkhanate rulers eventually converted to Islam. This event profoundly affected not only the political structure of the Mongol Empire, but also the cultural and religious balance in Iranian society. The adoption of Islam by these new Mongol rulers allowed Iran to once again become the intellectual and religious center of the region. My dear friends, think about it. How did this land, once conquered with blood and fire, become a temple of knowledge and culture that transformed the Mongols? Is this transformation not one of the greatest ironies of history? But this story does not end here. The influence of the Mongols in Iran was not limited to these lands. And how did this interaction shape the rest of the world? So, we will look for the answer to this question in our next meeting. My dear friends, now I will take you to Baghdad, blowing away the sands of time. For centuries, the capital of science, art, and culture. The jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, this city was the scene of such a tragedy in 1258 that its echoes can still be heard today. Shining brightly under the stars, Baghdad was once the meeting point for sages and merchants from all over the world. But that year a shadow fell over this city. Hulagu Khan and his unstoppable Mongol army were at the gate. Our story begins as Hulagu Khan moves westward to further expand the legacy of his grandfather, Genghis Khan. As ruler of the Ilkhanate, Hulagu was not only a warrior, but also a strategic genius. But his conquests were not just about gaining new territories. By destroying symbols of power and authority, Hulagu wanted to show the world the absolute dominance of the Mongol Empire. That is why he turned his eyes on the Abbasid Caliphate. This caliphate, with a 1,000-year history, was the heart of the Islamic world. Destroying the caliphate would have meant shaking not only a city but also a culture and a faith. The Mongol army at the gates of Baghdad was unlike any other army of that time. Their discipline, organization, and war techniques were unique. Before laying siege to the city walls, the Mongols called on the city to surrender. Caliph Mustasim underestimated this warning and thought they might offer resistance. Oh, what a mistake. Even when Hulagu Khan's army realized that it could not achieve victory directly on the battlefield, it would patiently continue the siege war, and that is exactly what happened here. The Caliph's resistance only fueled the Mongols' anger. When the siege began, the people of Baghdad were looking for a ray of hope. But the Mongols were unsurpassed in the art of war. Siege machines, catapults, and barricades crumbled the city walls one by one. The despair of the people rose with the smoke darkening the sky. When the walls were finally breached, the fate of the city was sealed. Baghdad seemed to be surrounded not just by an army, but by a wave of disaster. After the Mongols entered the city, they destroyed everything. Baghdad's famous libraries, those treasures of knowledge, those magnificent books, were thrown into the Tigris River. According to legends, the waters of the river turned black with ink. Thousands of manuscripts, thousands of years of knowledge, vanished in just a few days. Ah, my friends, this was one of those moments when not only the memory of a city, but the memory of humanity was lost. The fate of Caliph Mustasim is another tragedy. The Mongols wanted to symbolically destroy the Caliph's power. This man, who held the most sacred position in the Islamic world, was executed on the orders of Hulagu Khan. However, according to one account, the Mongols believed that bloodshed would bring bad luck. So they found another way to kill the Caliph. They wrapped him in a carpet and trampled him with horses. Thus, the Abbasid Caliphate disappeared into the dusty pages of history after more than 500 years of rule. The fall of Baghdad was not only the end of a civilization, it also created a huge vacuum in the leadership structure of the Islamic world. But my dear friends, this is where the irony of history comes in. In the wake of the destruction, the Ilkhanates began to build a new order in these lands. Baghdad, destroyed by the Mongols, was slowly rebuilt. The Mongols began to be influenced by the cultural richness of these conquered lands. But this transformation and the Mongols' conversion to Islam is the subject of another story. Now, my friends, think about it. How was one of the greatest centers of culture and science in world history destroyed overnight? And how did this destruction change the fate of the Mongols? Here, in our next story, we will follow the traces of this transformation together. Amen. Ah, my dear friends, through the mists of time I will take you to the Holy Land, to the narrow streets of Jerusalem and the fertile lands around it. For centuries this land has been the crossroads of religions, faiths, and civilizations, witnessing many wars, peace, and epics. But unfortunately, in the 13th century, these sacred places faced another threat: the unstoppable advance of the Mongol armies. The Mongol storm had risen from the steppes of Asia, creating a wave of destruction that stretched from China to Iran. Hulagu Khan captured Baghdad and buried the Abbasid Caliphate in the depths of history. But this conquest was only the beginning for him. Hulagu was determined to move further west on the great Mongol map he had drawn for himself. He set his sights on other holy sites in the heart of the Islamic world. Among these targets were Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina. Ah, my friends, you know the spiritual meaning of these cities. You feel that the land is woven not only of stones, but of prayers and faith. For the Mongols, however, these places were first strategic targets, and then symbols of power. Jerusalem, with its sacred values for Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, had been at the center of religious wars for centuries. At the time, Jerusalem was a city still recovering from the scars of the Crusades. The terrible reputation of the Mongols had already reached the walls of the city. People whispered how the cities turned to dust and ashes when Hulagu's armies were at their gates. The ruthlessness of the Mongols, their strategic genius during the sieges, and the horrific massacres that followed were like a nightmare. In the face of the Mongol threat, the inhabitants of Jerusalem could only pray, waiting for a miracle for their defense. The writing, however, Hulagu's expedition to the holy places came to an unexpected halt. The reason was an internal conflict within his own Mongol family that broke out during his westward march. A fight for the throne between the heirs of Genghis Khan forced Hulagu to send part of his army back east. But while this retreat allowed the people of Jerusalem to breathe a sigh of relief, everyone knew that the peace was short-lived. The Mongol threat was not only a fear of physical destruction, but also something that had a great resonance in the religious world. Fears that Hulagu's armies would target other holy centers of the Islamic world, such as Mecca and Medina, led to a cry for unity in the already divided Islamic world. The Mongols' intrusion into these holy places was seen as an attack not only on the Islamic faith, but also on the very soul of the land. The Mongols' indifferent attitude towards religions and the violence they inflicted on the peoples of the conquered territories created a wave of deep anxiety in the Islamic world. But interestingly, history tells us that the Mongols never reached these holy places. In a twist of fate, the Mongols were dragged into other wars, and this holy land was spared from their destructive hands. Ah, my dear friends, is it not chilling to think that the Mongol invasion was not only a wave of physical destruction, but also one that threatened beliefs and cultural heritages? Was it the prayers of the inhabitants of these lands, or the fate of destiny that saved Jerusalem and other holy cities? But in our next story, we will talk about how the Mongols transformed these lands, how the conquerors were conquered. What did the Mongols learn from this holy land? Let's look for answers to these questions in the next episode. Objectives for a bioterrorist threat. Ah, my dear friends, the year is 1260. The world is living through one of those dark days when the Mongol armies were rampaging. Hulagu Khan's armies had marched into the heart of the Middle East, wiping out the Abbasid Caliphate and leaving Baghdad in ruins. The legend of the Mongols' invincibility was ringing in everyone's ears like an echo spreading from east to west. In those days, the Islamic world was shaken and began to look for a savior to prevent this relentless invasion. But no one could have predicted that this young but determined force, the Mamelukes, would emerge on the stage of history. After crushing the Abbasid lands, the armies of Hulagu Khan turned their eyes further west. Egypt was the next target. Hulagu was no longer at the head of his army. He had been recalled to intervene in the Mongol throne disputes in the north. But he left Ketboga, an experienced commander in charge of his army. For the Mongols, the capture of Egypt was not just a conquest, It meant total control of the heart of the Islamic world. But my dear friends, fate sometimes plays a trick that surprises even the strongest. On the following day, the Mongol army had advanced as far as Palestine and reached a strategically important valley called Ain Goliath. You will hear the name of this valley often in the future, because it was not only a battlefield, but also a turning point that changed the course of history. Mobilized to stop the Mongol threat, the Mamluks gathered their armies under the leadership of a young leader, Sultan Qutuz. Qutuz knew that the task of defending the Islamic world rested on his shoulders, and his courage made him a hero in the hearts of his people. Next to him was another name that would go down in history, Emir Baybars. Baybar's military genius and tactical knowledge would play a key role in the outcome of this battle. When the day of battle came, the valley of Ain Goliath seemed to hold its breath. The Mongols were known for their superior technology and ruthless war tactics. But this time the Mamluks wanted to show that the Mongols would not have an easy victory. The Mamluk army entrenched in the valley had devised a clever plan to slow the Mongols down. Baybars thought to lure the Mongol army into a trap by devising a false retreat. Ambushing their enemies was a tactic the Mongols were not used to. And on that day, my friends, intelligence and courage clashed on the battlefield. The Mongols, fooled by the false retreat, pursued the Mamluks. As they retreated deeper into the valley, the Mamluk army suddenly turned back and cornered the Mongols. Swords flashed like lightning, arrows darkened the sky. Both sides were fighting to the death. This time, however, the Mongol army encountered an unusual resistance. The Mamluks had put their lives on the line to defend their ancestral beliefs and their lands. The Mongol army, led by Ketboga, despite all its might, unraveled in the face of the Mamluk superior strategy. And so, the first major defeat of the Mongols was written in history. This victory was not just the winning of a battle. Ain Goliath was a turning point that allowed the Islamic world to breathe again. With this victory, the Mamluks increased their prestige throughout the Islamic world and rose as a protective power. Sultan Qutuz and Emir Baybars became heroes in the eyes of the people. However, my dear friends, the events that followed this story are as striking as the battle itself. What was the fate of Qutuz after the victory? What kind of leader did Emir Baybars become with this victory? In the next chapter, I will tell you how these two great names took their place in history. Are you ready? Then be patient and wait. My dear friends, let me take you back to a time when screams and crumbling stone walls echoed from the depths of the past. Let us remember together those harsh winter days when the Mongols, rising from the endless steppes, advanced towards the Russian lands with the hoofbeats of their horses. It is 1240. Even as the cold penetrates your bones, the fire of the battlefield warms our hearts. This year, the quiet streets of Kiev witnessed one of the biggest storms in history. Batu Khan, one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, set out to expand the northern borders of the Mongol Empire. Batu Khan was no ordinary warrior, proving at every step that he deserved his grandfather's legacy, with both his sharp mind and his courage on the battlefield. But this time his target was no ordinary castle or village. Kiev was the beating heart of Russia, a city of deep history and faith. It was one of the most important centers of Orthodox Christianity, and the church domes rising to the sky symbolized the glory of Kiev like a golden crown. But those golden domes would soon be shaken by the hard blows of the Mongol army. Even the sky was filled with dark clouds as the Mongol army approached this ancient European city. The Mongol soldiers under Batu Khan's command were, as always, perfectly organized. Countless mounted archers, siege engines, and heavily armored troops were harbingers of doom. Behind the city walls, the people of Kiev waited in desperate expectation. The princes and commanders had gathered every soldier and resource in the city to resist the Mongol onslaught. But my dear friends, underestimating the might of the Mongols was as futile as trying to stop the storm with a candle. When the Mongol army stood in front of the walls of Kiev, it was not just a battle, but a moment of reckoning on the stage of history. First, the city was besieged. The Mongols chose to weaken the city's defenses with patience, rather than the usual swift attack. For weeks they waited outside the walls. Hunger, fear, and despair had begun to break the resistance of the people of Kiev. The Mongols' siege techniques were ingenious. Catapults rained stones and fire on the walls, and archers were so effective that no one in the city could get their head above the walls. Behind the walls, people were praying and watching the inevitable end approaching step by step. Finally, the moment had arrived. Suddenly, the Mongol army attacked with all its might. Batu Khan's strategies were so flawless that Kiev's defenses soon crumbled. As the city walls crumbled under the relentless blows of the Mongols, the people screamed. Mongol soldiers entered the city and razed Kiev to the ground. Golden domes, stone buildings, and old churches were destroyed one by one. Unfortunately, Kiev lost not only its stones that day, but also its soul. The city was almost completely destroyed at the hands of the Mongols. But Batu Khan's aim was not only destruction. He was laying the foundations of a great empire. The fall of Kiev struck fear into the hearts of not only the Russian lands, but also Europe. The ruins of Kiev paved the way for the birth of a regional khanate that the Mongols would call the Golden Horde. This khanate strengthened not only the power of the Mongol Empire, but also its control over trade routes. The Golden Horde would rule the Russian lands for many years, leaving deep traces of Mongol culture. But dear friends, this sad end of Kiev was also a harbinger of a beginning. Batu Khan's sights were set further west, deeper into Europe. Would the Mongols advance into the heart of Europe? If they moved forward, who can stop this unstoppable storm? The answer to this question is hidden in our next story. My dear friends, once again we will walk together through the misty paths of the past. This time, however, we are going back to a time when the Mongols, their hearts overflowing with the desire to rule, were at the gates of Europe. The year was 1241. Batu Khan had already brought the Eurasian steppes to their knees with the unstoppable power he inherited from his grandfather Genghis Khan, but it wasn't enough. No, Batu's eyes were dreaming of new lands stretching from east to west. The target was the heart of Europe, the fertile land stretching from Poland to Hungary. And what do you think happened in this expedition? Let's analyze this breathtaking story together. Driven by the fury of the steppe, Batu Khan moved towards Poland in the spring of 1241. The ancient lands of Europe were shaken by the hoofbeats of Mongol horses. Batu Khan's army resembled a work of art in its order of battle. Known for their swift and deadly attacks, the Mongols descended on Poland like a storm. And this storm set the stage for the great battle that would go down in history as the Battle of Legnica. Those were the days when the knights of Europe were at a loss for what to do in the face of Mongol arrows. The Prince of Poland, Henry II summoned all his courage and tried to resist the Mongols. But my friends, even courage can sometimes fall like a wall. At Legnica, the Mongols once again triumphed with their familiar battle tactics. They lured their enemies into a trap with a feigned retreat, then darkened the sky with a shower of arrows. The Polish army was in shambles, but Batu Khan was not satisfied with Poland. He set his eyes further south, on the rich lands of Hungary. The Hungarian kingdom was the next target in the heart of Europe. The Mongols marched into Hungary in April 1241, and soon one of the bloodiest battles in European history. The Hungarian king, Béla IV, had warned his people of the Mongol danger, gathered his entire army and tried to resist this deadly force. But the Mongols' art of warfare was very different from what Europe was used to. Batu Khan's armies trapped the Hungarian forces with their famous siege and archery tactics. The Hungarian army was trapped on the banks of the Tisza River. That day, my friends, even the waters of the river ran red with blood. The Battle of Mohi was the moment Europe's resistance was broken. Not only did the Mongols triumph, they left behind ruined villages, destroyed castles, and a people trembling with fear. Much of Hungary was burned to the ground, and King Béla barely escaped with his life, fleeing to the Adriatic coast. Mongol horsemen were plundering everywhere, and stories of their horrors spread across Europe. In those days, in every corner of Europe, people prayed, for this threat was not like a human army, nor like a storm. It was like a punishment from heaven. But my friends, there was something else behind Batu Khan's victories. Although the Mongols had pushed the gates of Europe, their inward march came to an abrupt halt. And why? It is said that a message from Karakorum, the Mongol capital at the time, forced Batu Khan's armies to retreat. The death of the great Khan Ogedai had triggered a struggle for the throne among the Mongol leaders. Batu Khan withdrew his armies to take part in this struggle and protect his own claims. Ah, my dear friends, as the footsteps of the Mongols receded into the distance, the people of Europe breathed a sigh of relief. But no one could know whether this victory was permanent or only a temporary respite. Nesachev, see me an adventure, said Salome. And now I ask you, if the Mongols were to return, could they change the history of Europe forever? We will see whether the Mongol horsemen will one day be at the gates of Europe again. Ah, my friends, now I will tell you about a battle so great that neither the waters of the Tisza River can forget this day, nor the winds of the Hungarian lands. The year was 1241, and the Mongol armies under the command of Batu Khan were marching towards Europe in all their might. After the victory in Poland, all eyes turned to the rich and fertile Hungary, the heart of Europe. As the hoofbeats of the Mongols' horses echoed across the vast plains, the Hungarian people were shaken with great fear, because they were here not only to conquer territory, but also to build an empire to subjugate. The Hungarian king Béla IV had anticipated this threat and sent letters to the other leaders of Europe asking for help. But oh, how divided the kings of Europe were in those days, how absorbed in their own affairs. Béla was left alone, yet he did not give up. He gathered an army to defend his people, knights, foot soldiers, commoners. The king gathered all kinds of forces. But my friends, as someone who knows the Mongolian art of war, I must tell you that this army was not strong enough to stand against Batu Khan's perfect plans. When Batu Khan and his army entered Hungarian territory, they moved like a shadow. They burned villages, destroyed castles, and terrorized the population. But it wasn't just brutality behind the destruction. The Mongols' war tactics were organized and brilliantly planned. Visualize it. Light cavalry watching the enemy's movements, spies gathering information, and a commander carefully planning every move. Batu Khan moved to pin down the Hungarian army near the Tisza River. This tactic set the stage for a battle that would go down in history, Battle of Mohi. The Hungarian army, thinking that the Mongols were outnumbered, hoped that they could defeat them. But, my friends, the Mongols' strength lay not only in their numbers, but also in their intelligence, speed, and ruthless planning. On the night of April 11th, 1241, the two armies faced each other on the Mohi plain. The Hungarian camp on the banks of the river was surrounded by a trap, but King Bila was unaware of it. The Mongols staged a feigned retreat during the night. The Hungarians dared to chase the enemy and were thus drawn into the trap. Opposed, Hungarian fifth, and the moment came. The darkness of the night was broken by the buzz of Mongol arrows. Fireballs ignited the tents. The heavy cavalry of the Mongol army attacked at first light. The Hungarian army was caught between two fires. On the one hand, the troops under Batu Khan's direct command, and on the other, flanking columns led by geniuses like Subutai. The waters of the Tisza River overflowed with soldiers trying to escape. Some managed to escape, but most were put to the sword or drowned in the river. That day, the heart of Hungary was shattered. Bela barely managed to escape and took refuge on the Adriatic coast. But this was not even a consolation for his people. The Mongol army had left a trail of destruction across Hungarian lands, consolidating its supremacy in Europe. Villages were burned and cities devastated. This battle clearly demonstrated the Mongol threat to Europe. A silence descended on the continent, questioning whether resistance was possible in the face of their power. But that, my friends, is not the end of the story. Why did Batu Khan turn back from his fast-moving victories? And what news was there in the Mongol lands? The answer is coming soon. But for now, I'll keep it a secret. My friends, the story of the Mongols rising from the lands of distant lands is told not only by the sharpness of their swords and the might of their armies, but also by their skill in controlling the roads that connect the world. I will now take you to the vast steppes of Central Asia, the heart of the Silk Road, one of the oldest and most valuable routes of mankind. It was not just a route for merchants to transport their goods, but a river of ideas, religions, and culture. But those who controlled the flow of the river also had the power to change the course of history. The Mongols knew this fact better than anyone. Taking over the legacy of Genghis Khan, his successors took over strategic cities in Central Asia one by one. Bukhara, Samarkand, Kashgar. These cities were not only the nodes of the Silk Road, but also treasures of wealth and knowledge. In conquering these cities, the Mongols acted not only with their swords, but also with their wits. They reorganized the trade routes, reassured the merchants, and turned the Silk Road into an artery to the four corners of the world. Imagine a merchant leaving China and traveling through Central Asia to Europe, all the way under the shadow of the Mongols, who ensured his safety along the way. The Mongols revolutionized not only warfare, but also trade. But every civilization has its dark side as well as its bright side. The Mongol control of the Mongols not only stimulated trade, but also brought heavy taxes and harsh rules. The weight of Mongol power was felt on every stone of this road. Merchants had to seek refuge in khans designated by the Mongols, and the profits of each caravan contributed to Mongol treasuries. But the result of this domination was a period of unparalleled peace in Central Asia. Pax Mongolica. This peace opened the doors to a golden age for both East and West. But, my friends, this peace came at a heavy price. The peoples of Central Asia were crushed under the Mongol yoke, and some were lost in this new order. Mongol domination changed not only the flow of trade but also the European imagination. In Europe, the fear that the Mongols would ravage the continent with their huge armies spread by word of mouth. Kings, lords, and even ordinary peasants spoke of a Tatar apocalypse coming from the east. Pope Innocentius IV tried to unite Europe against the Mongol threat. Unfortunately, the Europe of those days was a divided landscape. Instead of uniting, kings and city-states were competing against each other. The Pope decided to send envoys directly to the Mongol leaders. Ah, my friends, these ambassadors were no ordinary men. They were wise, pious, and skilled in the art of diplomacy. The most famous was Giovanni da Pian del Carpine. His journey took him from Europe to Central Asia. A journey took him from with great power the Mongols were. Pian del Carpine brought messages of peace to the Mongol leaders, while at the same time enabling Europe to get to know the Mongols better. He returned to Europe, taking note of the Mongols' war tactics, their system of government, and their way of life. Unfortunately, these diplomatic efforts did not lead to a grand alliance. The Mongols were still on Europe's horizon as a threat. But would this diplomacy be enough to stop the Mongol storm, or would Europe fall victim to its own internal strife? Ah, my friends, let's take a break here and now. But keep your curiosity alive, because in the next installment, we will explore together the opportunities and epic events that were lost between the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. Now I ask, would Europe be able to stand up against the Mongol threat? Or would this giant storm drag them into the depths of history? Ah, my dear friends, come, let me take you now from the fragile fortresses and vast plains of Europe to the depths of the endless steppes. The Mongols had descended upon Europe like that terrifying storm, setting the roads on fire and appearing as shadows that made kings tremble with fear. But, as fate would have it, these great invaders chose to turn and leave without taking root in Europe. And why? This story shows us that the Mongols were not only a war machine, they were also driven by political genius and pragmatism. By 1242, Batu Khan and his armies were terrorizing the vast lands of Europe. The victory at the Battle of Mohi had delivered the heart of Hungary into Mongol hands and opened the gates of Central Europe wide open. While Poland, Hungary, and the surrounding lands lay in the ruins of Mongol raids, the kings of Europe were still divided. They could neither form a united army nor develop a common strategy against the Mongol threat. At the time, it seemed only a matter of time before the Mongols completely conquered Europe. But it was at this point that the Mongol armies suddenly began to retreat. The peoples of Europe were astonished by this sudden reversal, as if a miracle had happened. However, this decision was not a simple change of strategy, but the result of Batu Khan's leadership vision and the internal dynamics of the Mongol Empire. Indeed, my dear friends, the Mongols did not conquer just for the sake of conquering. Controlling the conquered lands, establishing new administrations, and maintaining central authority were as important to them as victory. Hey, let's explore the story behind this comeback together. As Batu Khan marched deeper into Europe, he received great news. The great Khan Ogedei had passed away in his palace in remote Karakoram. In the Mongol Empire, the death of a Khan always meant great turmoil. Until a new Khan was chosen, there was a kind of uncertainty in the empire. And Batu Khan, as the leader of the Mongol Golden Horde Khanate, had to look after his own political interests. Completing the conquest of Europe took a long time and a lot of effort. However, the death of Ogedei imposed a more urgent responsibility on Batu Khan, attending the Mongol Congress and protecting the interests of his own family. Another reason, my dear friends, was the difficulty for the Mongols to rule the lands in Europe. The cities of Europe were very different from the steppes the Mongols were used to. More soldiers and logistics were needed to keep the conquered lands under control. But the Mongols' real strength was their ability to move quickly. For them, fixed fortresses and prolonged sieges did not fit their natural war strategy. Moreover, the Mongol armies had advanced so deep that supply lines were beginning to be jeopardized. Batu Khan, as a strategic genius, realized that further advances in Europe would only be a show of strength, but in the long run could deplete the empire's resources. However, the climate and geography of Europe was also a major challenge for the Mongols. The cold of the winter months, while difficult even for European peoples, could be deadly for Mongol horsemen. The Mongol steppe-like ability to move quickly was limited by the swamps and forests of Europe. Thus, Batu Khan decided to withdraw his armies, and this move was recorded as one of the most important strategic moves in Mongol history. They celebrated this retreat as a victory, but the reality was quite different. The Mongols had visited Europe like a temporary storm, then returned to the vast steppes of the east. But the Mongol threat never completely disappeared. In the memory of the peoples of Europe, the shadow of these powerful and relentless warriors remained for many years. But my friends, at the time when Batu Khan decided to retreat, the Mongol Empire in the east was about to take another turn. So what happened in the Mongol Empire after Ogedei's death? How did Batu Khan return to Karakoram and play a role in the struggles within the empire? And would the Mongols ever return to Europe? Wait for the next story to find out the answers to these questions. As you can see, the winds of history are blowing once again and taking us on a new adventure. Ah, my dear friends, today I will tell you about a turning point that echoes deep into history, a turning point that reshaped the destiny of the world. The Mongol Empire, founded under the leadership of Genghis Khan, became the largest land empire in history, stretching from east to west. But my friends, no empire can stay together forever. Just as the branches of a sycamore tree split over time, the Mongol Empire split in four after the death of Genghis Khan. And it was this division that gave birth to new khanates and changed the face of the world. During his lifetime, Genghis Khan not only conquered, but also built order. He united the scattered tribes of the Mongols under a single banner and turned their energy into a war machine. But as he lay dying in 1227, one question haunted everyone. How would such a vast empire survive in his absence? Genghis Khan left a will to his sons and grandsons. He divided the territory among them so that they could continue to rule the empire. However, this sharing did not lead to unity, but to divergence over time. Kushi, one of Genghis Khan's eldest sons, founded the Golden Horde in the north and west. This khanate stretched from the northern steppes of the Black Sea to the depths of Eastern Europe. The Golden Horde controlled the trade routes and made its presence felt as a permanent power on the eastern borders of Europe. This khanate reshaped Europe, not only with its warriors, but also with its economic influence. The Ilkhanids, on the other hand, dominated the Middle East under the leadership of another grandson of Genghis Khan. Spanning Iran, Iraq, and Anatolia, this Khanate became synonymous not only with military conquest, but also with cultural transformation. The Ilkhanids blended the Mongol discipline with the Islamic world and brought a new dimension to the art, science, and commerce of the Middle East. In fact, the Mongol conquests were not only destructive, but also a unifying force, bringing different cultures and societies closer together. My dear friends, this division of the Mongol Empire was not only a political event. It gave birth to a network that connected the world. The Silk Road, controlled by the Mongols, was a golden age of trade. Stretching from China to Europe, it became a highway where not only goods were exchanged, but also ideas, cultures, and technologies. Inventions such as gunpowder, the compass, and paper were carried westward with the encouragement of the Mongols and laid the foundations of the Renaissance in Europe. Reports say that most people didn't know that manufacturing was basically based on the hunch that we could make things from nothing at all. The impact of the Mongol invasions was not limited to trade. The Mongols' massive armies shook the feudal order in Europe and the Middle East. Kings and emperors realized that they needed stronger and more centralized authorities to counter the Mongol threat. This paved the way for the emergence of centralized kingdoms in many countries. At the same time, the Mongol conquests initiated an interaction between societies that had previously lived in isolation. This interaction created a domino effect that shaped the following centuries of world history. But dear listeners, the lasting traces left by the Mongols did not last as long as their political unity. The Golden Horde, the Ilkhanids, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty gradually came into conflict. These khanates began to lose power as they competed with each other. But the legacy they left behind is still felt in our world. It is possible to see the Mongol influence on the cool winds of the Silk Road, in the bazaars of the Middle East, even in the churches of Europe. Now I leave you with this question, dear friends. The unifying power of the Mongols changed the course of history. But how did the struggle between these khanates lead to the emergence of new players on the world stage? Let's explore the fall of these khanates and the rise of new powers in the next episode. My dear friends, as we move through the dusty pages of history, I will now take you back to a time when the warm winds of the Middle East were blowing and the Mongol storm was finally subsiding. Remember, once upon a time, the Mongol armies ravaged this land, razing cities to the ground and leaving the people in fear. However, just as the sky was re-enlightened after a violent storm, these lands were reborn under the influence of the Mongols to establish a new order, this time not under the shadow of swords and arrows, but under the blend of faith, trade, and politics. The Mongol relationship with the Islamic world was shaped by the different paths taken by the descendants of Genghis Khan. The Ilkhanids were the most important representative of Mongol rule in the Middle East. Initially, the harsh and destructive policies of the Mongols created a deep fear among the peoples. But things changed over time. When one of the Ilkhanate rulers, Genghis Khan, converted to Islam in 1295, the fate of these lands changed once again. Adopting Islam meant not only a religious conversion for the Mongols, but also a fusion with the culture of the region. Once alien to the conquered peoples, it is now adapted by adopting their beliefs and values. Genghis Khan and the other Ilkhanate rulers who followed him embarked on sweeping reforms to restabilize the region. Trade routes were repaired, devastated cities rebuilt, security on the Silk Road was restored, and traders, scientists, and artists once again flooded the routes. The echoes that once came from the battlefields were now replaced by the sounds of science and art, so much so that Tabriz, the capital of the Ilkhanates, became one of the most important cultural and commercial centers of the period. In these lands, a harmony was achieved where different peoples and beliefs lived together. However, the permanence of this new order would be tested by internal conflicts within the Mongol leadership and external threats. My friends, let us now take a look at the decline of Mongol dominance in the Middle East and the re-emergence of local powers on the scene. As the Ilkhanates began to weaken due to their own internal struggles, local dynasties in the region regained power. The Mamluks challenged the Ilkhanates on many fronts, with their strong presence in the south. On the other hand, Turkmen principalities in Anatolia took advantage of the Mongol weakness to declare their independence. And of course, amidst this chaos, the Ottomans were slowly emerging on the stage of history. The fall of the Ilkhanids paved the way for the emergence of these new powers. In Europe, the Mongol threat seemed to be a thing of the past. Although Tatar raids were still felt in the northern steppes of the Black Sea region, this threat gradually diminished with the weakening of the Golden Horde. In Europe, city-states and kingdoms focused on strengthening their political and economic structures in the period following the Mongol invasions. The trade networks left by the Mongols revitalized Europe's economy and strengthened ties with the Middle East. These ties were not limited to the trade of goods. They also enabled the transfer of culture, knowledge, and ideas. Dear friends, this is how the great empire of the Mongols disappeared from the world stage. But the traces they left behind in the lands they conquered changed history forever. So what kind of a world did these new powers, born after the destructive storm of the Mongols, build in their own time? How did the Ottomans, Mamluks, and other dynasties shape this legacy? Let us seek the answer to this question together on our next journey. Now turn up the heat a little more and get ready to hear the rest of the story.